Hello, and welcome to the Unseen Question. Why do you trust God? Seriously, have you ever stopped to ask yourself that question in a quiet, honest moment? Not while surrounded by people who already believe the same thing, not during a sermon or a prayer, but when you're alone, when the noise fades, and it's just you and that question. Why do you trust God? It sounds simple at first, but the more you think about it, the harder it gets. Most people would say they trust God because they were raised to, because that's what their family did, because it gives them comfort or hope or a sense of purpose. But those are feelings, not reasons. If you remove emotion from the equation, if you strip away habit, tradition, fear, and comfort, what's actually left to justify that trust? When you think about it, trust usually has to be earned. We trust people because they show up when they say they will, because they keep promises, because they do what they say. So how do you measure God by that same standard? If a friend kept disappearing every time you needed them, if they never spoke clearly, if they let terrible things happen to you while claiming to love you, would you still trust them? But with God, the rules change completely. He doesn't have to prove himself. He just gets a pass. Everything good is credited to him, and everything bad is written off as part of his plan, a plan that no one's ever seen, a plan that seems to justify anything, no matter how tragic. If something beautiful happens, thank God. If something horrible happens, trust God. Either way, he wins. The real question is, how did that double standard become normal? Why is it considered noble to trust someone who never shows up, never speaks directly, and never provides evidence? If any other relationship worked like that, we'd call it toxic. Yet somehow, when it's divine, it becomes sacred. Maybe that's because religion teaches people to distrust themselves, to believe that their doubts are dangerous, their reasoning is flawed, and their instincts are sinful. You're told that questioning is rebellion, that uncertainty is weakness, that curiosity is temptation. But if truth can't survive a question, is it really truth? Faith at its core asks you to surrender reason for reassurance, to believe first and ask later, or not at all. And that's not a coincidence. It's a design. From childhood, believers are taught to interpret every emotion, every coincidence, every twist of fate through one lens. That God is real, and everything proves it. Find a parking spot? God provided. Survive an accident? God protected. Lose someone you love? God needed them more. It's a closed loop of logic, one that can never be disproven because it explains away everything. But step outside that loop for just a moment, and you start to see cracks. Why does God heal one child's cancer but let another die in agony? Why stop a plane crash for a handful of survivors but ignore the hundreds who burn? If everything is part of his plan, what kind of plan includes so much arbitrary suffering? When people say they trust God, they're often trusting a story that someone else wrote centuries ago, a story passed down, edited, translated, and adapted to control, comfort, or convince. Yet those same people rarely stop to ask, how do we know it's true? How do we know the people who wrote those words weren't just men with power, politics, and agendas? Even the concept of God changes with geography. You trust one version of God because you were born in one part of the world. If you'd been born somewhere else, you'd probably trust a completely different one, with equal conviction. That's not faith. That's conditioning. Think about how religion creates dependency. When something goes wrong, you're told to pray. When something goes right, you're told to be grateful. But both responses keep you in the same posture, kneeling, always dependent, always small. You don't take credit for your achievements or responsibility for your failures, because everything is filtered through divine will. That kind of thinking keeps people docile, predictable, manageable. There's also the psychological side. Trusting God gives the illusion of control in a chaotic world. It turns randomness into meaning. It makes tragedy bearable by pretending it's purposeful. It makes death less frightening by promising something afterward. But comfort isn't the same as truth. We can invent meaning, but that doesn't make it real. When something painful happens, we crave answers. The human brain hates uncertainty. It would rather accept a bad explanation than no explanation at all. Religion fills that void perfectly. It offers ready-made reasons for everything that doesn't make sense, and calls that faith. But the cost of that comfort is high, because once you outsource your trust to an invisible authority, you stop trusting yourself. You stop listening to your own judgment. You stop growing. You stop asking. That's how people end up defending ideas they don't fully understand, quoting scriptures they've never questioned, and trusting a God who never actually answers. And here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. Most believers trust God because they're afraid not to. They're told that doubt leads to damnation, that disbelief brings punishment, that questioning will separate them from love, family, and heaven itself. That's not trust. That's coercion dressed up as devotion. It's strange how many people think God tests their faith, but never stop to consider that maybe faith is the test, a test of how much you're willing to believe without proof. And most people pass it not because they find evidence, but because they stop looking for it. When you strip away fear, habit, and tradition, there's very little left to justify trusting a deity who hides behind silence. Some will say, God works in mysterious ways, but that phrase is a way of avoiding the discomfort of not knowing. It's a placeholder for understanding, a shield against doubt. And yet, doubt is where progress begins. Every step forward in science, ethics, and human rights started with someone daring to question what everyone else just accepted. If trusting God meant trusting kindness, compassion, or moral integrity, that would be one thing. But historically, that trust has justified wars, discrimination, slavery, and suffering, all in His name. People have trusted God while burning others alive. They've trusted God while denying medicine, silencing women, persecuting minorities, and destroying lives. That's what happens when you give blind trust to an idea that no one can challenge. And yet you'll hear people say, I feel God's presence. But feelings are not evidence. People feel the presence of dead relatives, fictional characters, even ghosts. Our brains are wired to find patterns, to see agency where there is none. It's an evolutionary feature that once helped us survive, but now it feeds superstition. Maybe the real question isn't why people trust God, but why they need to. What is missing in our world, in ourselves, that we fill the gap with an invisible being? Is it loneliness, fear of death, the weight of randomness? Because once you start building trust on top of fear, you're not trusting, you're hoping, and hope can make us see things that aren't there. The truth is, humanity doesn't need divine permission to live ethically, love deeply, or act with purpose. We can build meaning ourselves. We can care for each other, not because we expect a reward, but because empathy is part of what makes us human. Trust, in its purest form, is based on evidence, on reliability, on proof. If someone claims to love you but never shows up, never speaks, and lets you suffer endlessly, would you still call that love? Or would you finally admit, maybe you've been the one keeping the faith alive? Maybe the trust we give to God should be redirected toward people, toward truth, toward the parts of ourselves capable of reason and compassion. Because if trust means closing your eyes to reality, it's not trust anymore, it's surrender. So next time someone says, I trust God, maybe the honest response isn't to argue or debate, but to ask gently, why? And if they can't answer without repeating what they've been told, maybe that's where the real conversation begins. Because in the end, trust should be earned, not inherited, not imposed, not demanded by fear of eternal consequences. Just earned, through truth, not tradition, through honesty, not habit, through what we can see, not what we're told to believe. And when you start from that kind of trust, you might lose a God, but you gain something far more valuable, yourself. There's something fascinating about how the mind defends belief, even when the evidence isn't there. When someone says they trust God, they're not just trusting an idea, they're protecting an identity. Because faith isn't just a belief system, it's a psychological home. It tells you who you are, why you're here, and where you'll go when you die. Questioning that isn't just uncomfortable, it's destabilizing. It's like pulling out the foundation of a house you've lived in your whole life. That's why people don't leave religion because of new facts. They leave because they find the courage to face the emotional cost of being wrong. It's not an intellectual issue as much as it is a psychological one. The human brain is wired for consistency. It wants its beliefs, values, and experiences to align. When they don't, it creates tension called cognitive dissonance. And the easiest way to ease that tension isn't by re-evaluating the belief, but by doubling down on it. That's why even when prayers go unanswered, believers often trust God more. They tell themselves it's a test, that there's a hidden reason, that someday they'll understand. It's not evidence that strengthens faith. It's the discomfort of facing the possibility that there might be none. In that sense, trust in God functions like a psychological self-defense mechanism. It protects the mind from uncertainty, because uncertainty feels like danger. It's easier to believe someone, even an invisible being, has a plan than to accept that the universe doesn't. There's a kind of emotional economy to religion. The harder life gets, the more valuable faith becomes. If someone loses everything, they can still say, I trust God. That statement offers a sense of control when there is none. It reorders chaos into meaning, but meaning doesn't have to come from illusion. Humans are capable of finding strength without inventing stories to hide behind. We can endure loss by understanding how the world works, not pretending it's part of a divine plan. We can find purpose in helping others, not waiting for divine instruction. We can face mortality by accepting it, not denying it. But that requires emotional maturity, something religion often discourages, because emotional independence threatens belief. Trusting God often replaces trusting yourself. You're told you're broken, sinful, unworthy, and that only through Him can you be whole. That narrative strips people of self-confidence and self-responsibility. It replaces internal strength with dependence. It teaches that moral guidance must come from above, not from within. And once you internalize that, you'll trust authority more than your own reason. That's how entire societies become obedient to dogma. If people can be taught to distrust themselves, they'll follow anyone who claims to speak for God. That's not faith, that's submission. And history shows us where that leads. Crusades, witch hunts, the silencing of thinkers, the persecution of minorities, all because people were told to trust without question. It's easy to underestimate how powerful that conditioning is. From the moment you're born, religion surrounds you. In songs, schools, traditions, and family, you're taught that faith equals goodness, that doubt equals danger. So when you start questioning, it feels like betrayal, not just of God, but of everyone you love. That's why so many stay quiet, not because they still trust, but because they're afraid to stop pretending they do. And yet, if you look closely, doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It's the birthplace of honesty. It's the mind's way of saying, wait, this doesn't add up. Doubt is the first spark of genuine integrity, the courage to align your beliefs with reality. Trusting God might feel like humility, but sometimes it's just fear wearing the mask of devotion. Fear of being wrong, fear of being alone, fear of being judged. Faith thrives on fear. Without it, the foundation weakens. That's why religions often teach that the world outside their belief is corrupt, evil, dangerous. Because if people stopped being afraid, they might stop believing. But what's so wrong with not knowing? What's so terrifying about uncertainty? The universe doesn't owe us answers. Maybe the beauty of existence is in the mystery itself. You don't need to assign purpose to everything to appreciate it. In fact, reality becomes more awe-inspiring when you realize it doesn't revolve around you or any divine agenda. There's an honesty in uncertainty. When you say, I don't know, you're being truthful. You're not filling the silence with superstition. You're facing existence as it is, unpredictable, chaotic, sometimes cruel, but also breathtakingly real. It's strange how believers often call non-believers lost, when in reality, most non-believers have simply stopped pretending they know something they don't. They're not lost. They're just comfortable with not having all the answers. That's not confusion, that's freedom. So when you hear someone say they trust God, remember, it's not always about belief in a deity. Sometimes it's about the need to feel anchored, to feel safe, to feel that life means something. But that sense of meaning doesn't require divine intervention. It just requires honesty. Maybe the more meaningful trust is the one we place in each other, in human empathy, in reason, in progress, in the idea that we can create purpose ourselves instead of borrowing it from Scripture. Trusting God might feel comforting, but trusting humanity with all its flaws and potential, that's where real courage begins. Because the moment you stop outsourcing your trust to something invisible, you start owning your life. You take responsibility for your choices, your growth, your mistakes. You stop waiting for signs and start creating direction. You stop hoping someone else will fix the world and start realizing it's always been up to us. Maybe that's what scares people most, that there's no higher plan, no safety net, no divine script. But that realization isn't bleak, it's liberating. Because if there's no cosmic puppeteer, then everything you do matters more, not less. Every act of kindness, every moment of love, every pursuit of truth, it's all you. And that's something worth trusting. When people say, without God, life has no meaning, they're missing something essential. Meaning isn't discovered, it's made. It's built through connection, through learning, through experience. It's written in how you treat others, how you handle suffering, how you leave the world better than you found it. That's meaning, and it doesn't vanish without religion. So, why do people trust God? Maybe because it's easier than trusting themselves, because it's simpler to believe there's a cosmic parent watching over them than to accept the weight of uncertainty. But maturity is learning to carry that weight, to live without illusion, to find strength in truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And maybe that's what real faith looks like. Not faith in gods or scriptures, but in our ability to face reality with open eyes. Because in the end, the question isn't, why do you trust God? The question is, what could your life look like if you stopped? What if trust wasn't something handed down through doctrine, but something you earned through evidence, reason, and compassion? What if you stopped waiting for divine permission and started trusting the quiet voice inside you, the one that's been asking questions all along? Maybe that voice isn't rebellion. Maybe it's the first sign of awakening. There's something quietly powerful about realizing how much of society still runs on inherited trust. Trust in a God that no one can see, yet whose name is used to justify nearly everything. From the laws we pass to the wars we fight, From who people can love to what they can learn in school, that invisible trust still shapes the visible world. But when trust in God becomes the foundation of morality, things get complicated fast. Because morality stops being about what's right, it becomes about what's commanded. And that's a dangerous trade. When people believe goodness depends on obedience, they stop asking whether the rules themselves make sense. They just follow. And that kind of blind trust can make good people do terrible things. Think about it. When someone commits violence in the name of their faith, they almost always believe they're doing something righteous. They're not trying to be evil, they're trying to please the same God they trust completely. History is full of people who did horrifying things while sincerely believing they were serving divine will. That's what happens when morality is outsourced to something that can't be questioned. But the irony is, if morality comes from God, then it should be universal. Yet every religion defines it differently. Some gods bless mercy, others demand blood. Some command forgiveness, others vengeance. If divine morality were absolute, there wouldn't be thousands of interpretations of what God wants. What people call divine truth is often just human opinion, wrapped in holy language. That's the danger of blind trust. It replaces thinking with authority. It stops people from saying, wait, is this actually good? It convinces them that obedience itself is good. But morality isn't about following orders. It's about empathy, the ability to understand and care about how your actions affect others. And that doesn't come from scripture. It comes from experience, from reflection, from the simple recognition that other people feel pain just like you do. The idea that we need God to be moral is one of the oldest and laziest assumptions in human history. People act morally because we evolved as social beings who depend on each other to survive. Long before organized religion, cooperation, compassion, and fairness helped our ancestors thrive. Morality wasn't handed down from a mountain. It was built from the ground up. If you need the threat of hell or the promise of heaven to be a good person, you're not moral, you're bargaining. Real morality is choosing kindness even when there's no reward. It's doing the right thing because it's right, not because you think someone's watching. But religion blurs that line. It ties goodness to loyalty, and loyalty to belief. You're not just asked to be good, you're asked to be faithful. And in that system, doubt becomes a sin, even if it's the most honest thing you'll ever feel. That kind of mindset seeps into everything. It affects politics, education, relationships. It teaches people to value conformity over truth, to prioritize comfort over honesty. It's why some still deny science, resist progress, or reject entire groups of people. Not because they've reasoned it out, but because their trust in God tells them they're right. And the strange part is, they rarely see it as trust, they see it as certainty. But certainty is an illusion. The moment you're completely certain of something that can't be proven, you've stopped thinking critically. You've replaced curiosity with confidence. That's not faith, that's indoctrination. The truth is, societies don't collapse without religion. They evolve. They start relying on reason, empathy, and evidence instead of superstition. Secular nations consistently score higher in happiness, education, equality, and social trust. When morality is built on compassion instead of commandments, people don't become worse, they become freer. Because when your ethics are grounded in humanity instead of divinity, they can change when evidence changes. You can admit mistakes. You can grow. Religious morality, on the other hand, often can't. It's fixed, written in stone. And once something is God's word, no one dares to challenge it, even when it's harmful. That's why progress so often comes from people willing to question what everyone else trusts. Abolition, women's rights, LGBTQ equality, all of it required challenging God's plan. Every time humanity has moved forward, it's been because someone trusted reason over revelation. And yet even today, people still say, without God, what stops you from doing bad things? The answer is simple: empathy, education, accountability, and a sense of shared humanity. We don't need divine threats to act decently. We just need to care about each other. That's morality that scales with understanding, not obedience. It's interesting how religious trust often disguises itself as humility. People say they're surrendering their will to God, but really they're surrendering their autonomy to an idea. And that idea is always interpreted by people: pastors, priests, imams, leaders. Trust in God becomes trust in whoever claims to speak for him. And that's where the danger lies. Because divine trust gives human authority untouchable power. If you believe a command comes from God, you'll follow it no matter how irrational it is. If you believe your leader is divinely guided, you'll excuse their corruption. If you believe your suffering is divinely ordained, you'll stop fighting for change. That's how trust becomes control. The truth is, religion doesn't survive on evidence. It survives on emotional loyalty. It tells people that questioning their faith is arrogance, that doubt is dangerous, that disbelief is pride. But the opposite is true. Thinking critically isn't arrogance, it's responsibility. It means you take truth seriously enough to test it. And when you start testing that trust, the answers get uncomfortable. Why does an all-loving God allow children to die of hunger while blessing others with wealth? Why do prayers for healing fail at the same rate as random chance? Why is every miracle conveniently unverifiable? The silence that follows those questions isn't mystery, it's absence. Still, millions keep trusting because they've been told that trust itself is virtue, that believing despite the evidence is stronger than believing because of it. But think about that for a moment. In any other situation, trusting someone who gives you no reason to is considered naive. Only in religion is it considered sacred. When you look at the world through that lens, it becomes clear. Humanity doesn't need more faith. It needs more honesty. It needs people willing to say, I don't know, but I want to find out. Because real understanding doesn't come from blind trust. It comes from open inquiry. And that's where the future is heading. More and more people are stepping away from religion, not out of anger, but out of clarity. They're realizing that morality, purpose, and wonder don't vanish when you stop trusting God. They expand. You begin to see beauty in reality itself, in the stars that don't need angels, in the kindness that doesn't need commandments, in the love that doesn't need divine approval. When trust shifts from God to people, something remarkable happens. Responsibility returns. You start realizing it's on us to make the world better, not some invisible force. We stop waiting for salvation and start creating solutions. We stop praying for change and start becoming it. And maybe that's the real challenge of growing up, to stop believing that someone else will fix things and start realizing it's all in our hands. Trusting God can feel safe, but trusting yourself, trusting truth, evidence, and compassion, that's real strength. It's harder, lonelier, and sometimes unsettling, but it's honest. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, is the only kind of trust that actually builds something real, because faith asks you to close your eyes and believe. Reason asks you to open them and see. So the question still stands, why do you trust God? And maybe the real answer is, you don't have to. When you finally start asking that question, why do I trust God? Something subtle begins to shift inside you. It's not rebellion. It's not arrogance. It's clarity. You begin to notice how much of what you've called faith has really been fear. Fear of meaninglessness, fear of punishment, fear of losing a comforting story that told you everything would make sense one day. And when that fear starts to fade, what's left isn't emptiness, it's freedom. Because when you stop trusting a silent authority that never answers, you start listening to the world that actually does. You start paying attention to what's real, the people you love, the problems you can solve, the moments that give your life depth. You stop trying to find divine purpose in every event, and you start creating purpose where it's needed most. That's the strange beauty of letting go. You don't lose meaning, you reclaim it. You stop being a passive participant in someone else's plan and become the author of your own. That's what genuine responsibility feels like, not waiting for a higher power to act, but realizing that you are capable of shaping your world. You can't pray injustice away, but you can fight it. You can't beg for miracles, but you can make change. You can't rely on invisible forgiveness, but you can apologize, repair, and grow. Every act of kindness, every moment of integrity, every decision to help someone instead of hurting them. That's real morality. It doesn't require divine supervision. It just requires conscience. The irony is, once you stop trusting God to do everything, you start trusting humanity to do something. You stop assuming the universe owes you fairness and start taking fairness seriously yourself. You start seeing that the real miracle isn't divine intervention, it's human compassion, the ability to look at chaos, pain, and uncertainty, and still choose to do good anyway. That's the kind of trust that builds civilizations. The trust that if we work together, think critically, and care honestly, we can make a difference. We don't need a God to save us from our own flaws. We just need the courage to confront them. And maybe that's what's been missing in so many conversations about faith. People assume that without God, life is bleak, but it's the opposite. When you stop trusting in the unseen, you start seeing the unbelievable, how vast the cosmos is, how fragile our existence is, how lucky we are to be conscious at all. The universe doesn't have to love you for it to be magnificent. Its indifference doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it authentic. You start realizing that the world doesn't revolve around divine purpose. It revolves around connection, around the small acts that ripple outward, around the shared understanding that this short, improbable life is all we get. And that's exactly what makes it precious. Think about it. If you knew there was no afterlife, wouldn't you live more intensely? Wouldn't you cherish your loved ones more deeply, use your time more carefully? seek truth more fearlessly? When you remove eternity from the equation, every second matters infinitely more. That's not hopelessness. That's appreciation at its purest. When you stop trusting God to give your life meaning, you start giving it meaning yourself. You stop waiting for signs and start making choices. You stop praying for guidance and start learning from consequence. You stop deflecting responsibility onto fate and start taking ownership. That's what real trust looks like. Trusting yourself to be ethical even when no one's watching. Trusting your mind to seek truth even when it challenges what you've been taught. Trusting that kindness and empathy are worthwhile even if there's no cosmic scorekeeper keeping track. And it's not that believers are foolish or weak. Most are sincere, genuinely trying to make sense of a confusing world. But sincerity doesn't make something true. People once sincerely believed the earth was flat, that diseases were caused by demons, that lightning was divine anger. Sincerity is easy. Evidence is harder. Faith asks for surrender. Truth asks for effort. So maybe the challenge isn't to destroy belief, but to outgrow it, to replace inherited trust with earned understanding, to see that wonder doesn't require worship and morality doesn't require mythology, to realize that we can love, create, forgive, and dream without divine permission. That realization doesn't make life smaller, it makes it bigger, because instead of waiting for meaning to be revealed from above, you get to uncover it yourself, moment by moment, choice by choice. So if you ever find yourself asking, why do I trust God? Maybe the better question is, why don't I trust myself? Why don't I trust my own ability to think, to love, to decide what's right? Why don't I trust the evidence in front of me, the experiences that shape me, the humanity that connects me to everyone else? If a belief demands blind trust, maybe it doesn't deserve it. If it silences questions, maybe it fears the answers. If it thrives on guilt, maybe it's not guiding you, it's trapping you. There's nothing noble about believing something just because you're told to. Real strength comes from facing uncertainty and choosing honesty anyway, from standing on your own, even when the ground feels shaky, from building a worldview that can withstand scrutiny, not just comfort you when things get hard. Trust isn't supposed to be blind, it's supposed to be built, it's supposed to grow through evidence, honesty, and experience. And when it comes to something as massive as God, the creator of everything, the alleged designer of reality, shouldn't the standard for trust be higher, not lower? So, why do you trust God? Because someone told you to? Because you're afraid not to? Because it feels good to think someone's in control? Those are human reasons, not divine ones. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee it. The truth is, life doesn't need a guardian in the sky. It needs awareness here on earth. It needs compassion, curiosity, and courage. The world doesn't get better through prayer. It gets better through people who stop waiting for miracles and start becoming them. So maybe in the end, the question isn't meant to be answered. Maybe it's meant to unsettle, to make you pause long enough to ask yourself whether the trust you've given is really yours or something you inherited. Because trust, like belief, only means something if it's chosen freely, after you've looked at everything honestly. And maybe that's where the real freedom begins, not in trusting what you can't see, but in finally trusting what you can. There's a quiet moment that comes after the questions, after the fear fades and the noise of dogma stops echoing in your head. It's the first breath of real silence, not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels alive, the kind that reminds you that you don't need someone else's answers to exist meaningfully. You start to see the world differently, not as a test or a waiting room for eternity, but as something astonishing in its own right. The sunlight on your skin, the pulse in your wrist, the breath in your lungs, none of it needs divine permission to matter. It just does. You realize how much time humanity has spent waiting for gods to fix what we could have fixed ourselves, waiting for guidance that never comes, forgiveness we can grant each other, justice we can build, and peace we can create. The waiting ends when trust returns to where it belongs, within us. When you stop kneeling, you start standing. You begin to understand that morality isn't obedience, it's empathy. That meaning isn't discovered, it's made. That hope doesn't fall from the sky. It's grown carefully through courage and compassion. And suddenly, you're no longer afraid of the question, why do you trust God? Because the answer doesn't matter anymore. The power of the question is what it reveals. It strips away the illusions and leaves something raw, honest, and human. The simple desire to understand. That desire is sacred enough. You don't need a higher power to bless it. Curiosity, kindness, and reason, they're not enemies of faith. They're what faith should have been all along. Maybe the point was never to trust the unseen, but to finally trust yourself to see clearly, to know that your mind, flawed as it is still your best tool for finding truth, that your heart, fragile as it feels, is still your best compass for love. And when you trust those things, your reason, your empathy, your humanity, you don't need to fear being lost, because you've already found something far more real than certainty, awareness. Maybe that's what freedom sounds like. Not loud or triumphant, but quiet and steady. The sound of your own thoughts, unafraid. The sound of your conscience, no longer begging for permission to question. The sound of your own trust, returning to you. Because in the end, you don't need to trust in gods to live a good life. You just need to trust that goodness itself is worth living for.